Well, hello and welcome to today's HIPAA Chat. I'm Carol Flagg of Answers Media Network. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to be talking and taking your questions around privacy and security by design. EFX Corporate is sponsored by, HIPAA Chat is sponsored by EFX Corporate, which is a brand of J2 Cloud Services. Founded in 1995, J2 is an award-winning leading provider of internet services through its two divisions, Business Cloud Services and Digital Media. They have products that can help with the secure transmission of EPHI, so please check them out. Our host, of course, is David Harlow. David is a healthcare lawyer and consultant with 25 years of public and private sector experience. He is our regular host for HIPAA Chat, and we are very thankful to have him on board as always. You can contact him at david@harlowgroup.net. You can also read his award-winning blog, www.healthblog, that's BLAWG.com. David, it's great to have you back for another HIPAA Chat, and for those of you who are new to HIPAA Chat, and even those who are returning, you can find us on YouTube for previous HIPAA Chats. You can go to the link as you see below, or you can go to YouTube and search HIPAA Chat, and we will pop up everywhere. You can also check out our podcast on healthcarenowradio.com program/HIPAA Chat. You'll find an archive of those podcasts as well as on our SoundCloud channel. And of course, HIPAA Chat streams live at 12 noon and 7 p.m. Eastern on our internet radio station, healthcarenowradio.airtime.pro. Finally, follow us on LinkedIn on our HIPAA Chat group. Sorry, I forgot to talk about these other resources. How are you today?
I'm okay. Hi, Carol, and thanks for that warm welcome. And hello, everybody, and welcome to HIPAA Chat.
Our favorite show of the month.
Oh, great. Everybody loves to talk about HIPAA. Can't talk about HIPAA enough, can we now? I mean, let's be honest.
Well, you know, it's not that you can put fun in HIPAA. I mean, you know, these are very serious, obviously, topics that we address and take questions on. But at the same time, we can certainly have a little fun along the way. Although I know you're going to start talking about some recent breaches in the news, which is not, of course, fun. But again, for those of you who are joining us for your first HIPAA Chat, please use the question box on the dashboard to pose your question, and we will be, as always, lots of time to address what's important to the audience regarding our topic.
So, Carol, yeah, if we weren't laughing, we'd have to cry because the news is miserable. It's starting with WannaCry and just taking off from there. We had that whole experience with WannaCry a couple months ago, and then the NotPetya ransomware sort of bootstrapping on the same exploit, the Eternal Blue vulnerability that WannaCry took advantage of. And between the two of these ransomware incidents, a tremendous number of healthcare organizations, both in the US and abroad, have been affected to the point where some providers basically had to junk their computers, their physical computers, and were forced to work using paper forms only. I mean, you can't shut down a general hospital just because the computers aren't working. People are still coming in the door. People are still sick. You might be able to cancel elective surgeries, but you can't really just shut down entirely. And in one hospital, an office worker saved the day by taking the forms that were included in the disaster management plan by the hospital and printing them out and putting them in a binder. If that step had not been taken, otherwise the plan and the forms were available only on the hospital network. And if they hadn't been printed out just by somebody who was sort of taking that extra step, the belt and suspenders, that hospital would have been in dire circumstances.
I hope that employee got a raise.
I certainly hope so. Yeah. So, simple thing, but when you're planning for a digital nightmare, you need to have some analog tools in place. And by in place, they need to be printed out so you can actually use them. Otherwise, they're useless.
Right. All right. So privacy and security
Yeah.
by design. Of course, when I think of design, I mean, I immediately think of like I don't know if this is correct or incorrect, but like a blueprint, just, so that I know how the HIPAA house is going to be built, I guess.
Right. It's a blueprint, but it's more about the thinking part here.
Right.
It's a mindset that we're talking about. So it's not just how do I design for healthcare privacy and security, because if we were to take that sort of approach, we might default to say, oh, well, I'm going to buy this product that somebody's built and is selling to me, and it's supposed to work, and it's supposed to be wonderful, and it's one size fits all, and it's terrific. That doesn't really necessarily work, because as we know, the single largest vulnerability that we have are our quote unquote soft assets, are human
Oh,
beings,
yeah.
are human beings. And it's the idiosyncrasies and the behaviors of humans that really form the greatest proportion of our vulnerabilities. In the scheme of things, it's relatively easy to fix the technical issues. Obviously, there's still some holes, and more holes are discovered, and they get patched, or they should get patched, and patching then becomes a human activity, and people fall down on the job in terms of patching. That's why we had the exploits by the WannaCry and NotPetya ransomware incidents, because things hadn't been patched. And that's really a human failing, not a technical failing. But back to the question of, so when we say design thinking, what do we mean? It's really a question of combining sort of the user experience and the design toolkit in order to improve things for the future. Carol, I don't know if we have the additional examples on the next slide here on design thinking. If not, we'll just talk it through from here.
Yeah, there we go.
Yes, there we go. Yeah. So it's really a series of steps that one needs to go through in order to be working in this mode. So just sort of run through these quickly and note that these are not necessarily things that are done in any particular order, but we can start with the empathize step. But we'd ordinarily start with that, but we can certainly start, and we need to iterate, and we go back and around across and sideways through this circle in order to keep building things. We start with the idea of trying to really understand the problem that we're trying to solve. And the problem that we're trying to solve is not just a technical problem, it's a human problem. So somebody creating a solution locked away in a bunker somewhere is not going to be able to design a solution that really works well for humans in the real world. And that's an important thing to think about, because often we have solutions delivered to us by technical wizards who are not familiar with the way things work in our world, whether that's a hospital, a physician practice, or some other setting. So it's important to understand that. You need to understand users needs, the problems that really need to be solved as they exist in the wild. Then you sort of define the scope of the solution, establish features, functions of a solution, and you need to think about it again in terms of the end users. How are we going to solve this particular problem in this particular setting, not something much more abstract. And then from there, there's the ideation phase, sort of the brainstorming phase. You need to sort of think things through, throw things against the wall, investigate, test ideas, find the best way to solve a problem, or come up with ways to get around the problem. Sometimes the best way to deal with the problem is just to go around it. And that's something that you can do in this context as well. I'll get back to that as we continue our conversation. The next step after that is prototyping. Build things, try things out. Not everything is going to work, even if at the brainstorming phase it seems like a terrific idea. You build things may break. They need to be improved. They need to be investigated. They need to be rejected if that's what has to happen based on user experience. Again, often we're looking at tools that skip some of these steps, and that's why we are so darn frustrated when we're using them.
Right.
Next step is testing. So even after the testing that's sort of inherent in this prototyping step, we really need to test the complete product, not just an individual element or screen or step of the process. And then we're back to full circle, and we may ping back from testing to brainstorming if the testing turns up some problem that needs to be reworked out. Or maybe the testing phase identifies the fact that we've defined the problem poorly. We need to go back and redefine the problem. So the whole point here of sort of highlighting this approach to solving problems is to get the thoughts going in everybody's mind and the thinking going in everybody's mind around how do we solve problems? How do we arrive at solutions for privacy and security issues? I don't want to just focus on, oh gee, and we can always tell the story. I mean, there was a breach recently. This is on the international front, but there's a recent breach. 500,000 customers. Data released by a rogue employee, basically, by a company called BUPA. This is reported overseas. That's a huge number of data points being released into the ether. And the question is, why did that happen? How can we avoid that problem? Is there a way to, as I said before, get around that issue? We're always going to have disgruntled employees, rogue employees. What can we do when we build our systems so that a single rogue employee doesn't really have the power to
Take it
cause
down.
such a giant problem? I mean, there are very few people, if any, in any organization who should have all of the keys at hand in order to cause that large problem. If they do, then we have a design problem in the system. And that's what we really need to do, sort of step back and think about how can we avoid issues rather than trying to fix them after the fact. It's going to be a lot easier to do that. And as we grow, as these incidents grow in size, the WannaCry and the NotPetya ransomware issues, there was a report that came out in the past couple of days from Lloyd's of London, and their projection was that there could be a single cybersecurity attack, cybersecurity event in the US that could cost more than the direct damages from Hurricane Katrina.
Oh, wow.
So if you think about things in those terms, if you think about the horror that was Hurricane Katrina and think, gee, that could happen with somebody's single click, and the answer is, yes, it could. And that is just an enormous risk, and none of us should want to be running that risk. So there's a whole lot of stuff that we need to be doing in order to avoid putting ourselves in that situation.
in this sort of design thinking circle, empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test, and recognizing that our audience is very small providers up to the largest hospital systems in the U.S. So it's tough to maybe address this question, but generally in this design thinking environment, who are the types of people that should be involved? Should the small medical practice or in the hospital? I mean, is there a common thread as to who should be involved in this group thinking mentality?
Sure, fair question. So this is really a template for product designers, right? But in the end, customers are really the ultimate product designers. And you're going to vote with your feet when you see something that is going to work for you or is not going to work for you. What I'm suggesting here is that part of the due diligence in choosing privacy and security products and approaches that you're going to use to try to improve your practices or your institutions. This is a way of looking at it. This is a way of thinking, gee, is this just some guy in a bunker somewhere who wrote some code and is now trying to sell me a product? Or is this someone who really understands what a 10-physician practice is like? Because
Right.
if you don't have that empathy, you can't define a problem and you can't create a solution for the problem. So this is really a way of thinking about how to shop for, if you will, an appropriate solution or solution provider.
Right. That's a great comment to make there. So, and I know that we're going to be talking, taking questions a little bit about security risk analysis because that comes into play here, and we've already got a couple in the queue. So we're going to start taking some questions from our audience, and we've got some from the people who registered, of course, earlier. And if we don't get to your question or you need a more in-depth answer than David can provide on today's HIPAA chat, you can email him at david@harlowgroup.net. You can always email me, carol@hightechanswers.com, and of course, I'll forward that on. And again, check out his blog, healthblog, blawg.com, and follow him on Twitter at healthblog. He has a very robust Twitter presence out there, and has a lot of followers and a lot to say. So I'm going to jump right in with the first question. So is this something we need to be concerned about if we're not in the cloud yet? I think it's interesting that the person asking the question said yet. Presumably they're planning to be there at some point, but not quite there yet.
Sure. So the answer is yes. And then the question is, what does the question mean when you say, what do we have to be concerned with this? I'm going to say yes, no matter what this is. We do need to be concerned about privacy and security, and we do need to be concerned about design thinking. So let me take that one step at a time. Why do we need to be concerned about health data privacy and security if you're not in the cloud? Well, initially, the application of HIPAA was limited to situations where people were submitting bills electronically, right? So we're way past that now. HIPAA applies to electronic information, but it also applies to paper information. So let's just put that on the table, get that out of the way. And it applies to electronic information, whether it's stored on premises or whether it's stored on the cloud. Okay, so the application of HIPAA and other regulatory structures, as I've discussed before in HIPAA chat, it's not just about HIPAA. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that you need to be concerned about, other federal rules and state rules as well. Once you acknowledge that you need to be concerned about privacy and security of patient data, doesn't matter where it is, doesn't matter what form it's in, and then you get to the question of, well, how am I going to secure it? And again, back to my earlier comment, the design thinking approach will help you think about, in a more focused way, what is the exact problem that I need to solve, and how am I going to solve it in a way that makes sense in my setting? Because that's really the ultimate question. You want to implement something that is not one size fits all. You want to implement something that's actually going to be workable in your own context. And I have to say that this is a way of thinking that applies not only to software products that you might use, but it also applies to the application of the HIPAA rules. The federal government agency responsible for HIPAA enforcement is on record saying that we recognize that a small practice is not the same as an academic medical center, and we don't expect the same kinds of solutions to be implemented in the two places. The rules need to be addressed, but they need to be addressed in a way that makes sense for the particular setting. Now, you need to document why it makes sense. So it's not just, oh, I'm just a small little physician practice, leave me alone, regulators, I'm doing what I can. That's not a sufficient approach to take here. A sufficient approach is, I'm just a small physician practice here. I do not have a 25-person IT staff, so I need to take things a little more slowly, a little more compactly. I need to do things in a way that's reasonable for us, but you still need to do them. And you need to document why you're doing it and the way you're doing it and how exactly you are doing it.
And I would also say, and this is, people sometimes, our attendees and listeners sort of get caught up about like the audit aspect of this. If they, if they don't do what needs to be done from a documentation standpoint, they could be audited. I mean, that's such it's a very small part of this whole thing, because obviously, if you have a breach, your reputation of that and what happens with that is much more significant than perhaps an imposed fine by OIG.
Sure. I mean, even it would be OCR, the Office of
I
Civil
mean
Rights.
OCR rather,
Yeah.
sorry, yeah.
And look, even for a small practice, a $150,000 fine is going to be a significant issue. But the broader issue is, as you say, correctly, reputational. And in addition, having the government in your hair while you work out a plan of correction.
Right, right.
That makes it much harder to
Right,
operate.
right. How can we, next question, how can we use design thinking specifically to guard against ransomware?
So using design thinking to protect against ransomware. So again, the question of, what is design thinking and how does it apply to me in this situation? You need to think about what is really relevant to you in your particular situation. And you need to think about designing a system that is going to work for you in your particular situation. So, as I said before, these two particular ransomware exploits that we're dealing with
Yeah.
in recent memory both had to do with the fact that people were running Windows XP and they hadn't applied the security patches that had been released by Microsoft. I'm sorry, XP and also later versions of Windows
Right.
have the same vulnerability. But the point to note there is that Microsoft actually went back and created a patch for XP, which is officially after its quote-unquote end of life, and pushed that out to users. So they provided a patch, okay? So if you need to think about what is our culture? How do we operate now? So you need to empathize with yourself, if you will, in order to
Self-empathy.
in order to define the problem. You
Yeah.
know, so is the problem is we don't trust automatic updates from Microsoft, and therefore that's why we never applied the patch to Windows, and that's why we were hit with WannaCry. Well, you know, I think all other things being equal, it's time to just sort of set your security updates on automatic and let Microsoft take over your machine and install updates and patches as they become available. This is a very important thing to do in general. And you need to work around the rest of your workflow so that those automatic updates don't interfere with operations. So, you know, as people do, have them set to go off at 2 in the morning. Just
Right,
so it's
right,
not going to interfere with your daily work.
right.
But you have to do that. You have to have those in there. So you need to think about that sort of vulnerability and think about what am I doing and why am I doing it? How am I putting myself at risk and why am I putting myself at risk? You really have to dig that one layer deeper and then think, well, is there a good reason that I'm not doing it? Have I had a bad experience with Microsoft automatic updates in the past? Then do it manually. It's okay. You can do it manually too, but you have to do it every month or every week, depending on the product, whether it's Microsoft or some other software package that you're using from another vendor. If it's hosted in the cloud, it's probably being automatically updated without you doing anything. That's another advantage to using some of the
Right,
cloud-hosted
right.
products.
And
So,
like you
you know,
said, done at, 2 a.m. in the morning or, whenever. Right,
right,
right.
exactly.
Right. And of course, we've all been there, especially with some of the Microsoft updates that, there's a little, it gives you a little pop-up and you can, do it now and it'll restart your computer, or you can delay it till later. And then, you just keep delaying it, delaying it. I mean, it just sort of, I mean, I'm guilty of doing it, and eventually I go, oh my gosh, I need to do this because, David Harlow, I've got you in my head, but it's just like,
Right.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, it's just one of those things where, and a good IT person, obviously, not a good IT person, I shouldn't say that, but certainly, with the right design thinking, there is a way to get these done correctly so that it's not done in the middle of the day when your front desk is super busy, and the idea of like not having the computer in front of you to do
Right.
your work
Right.
is right, right.
Right, exactly.
So
And look, there are paper issues here too. It's not just
sure.
about the computer issues. So in the early days of HIPAA, people were very concerned, well, gee, if I have you know, a folder with a patient's chart and um, in a little cubby on the door of an exam room, and the patient's name is visible, is that a HIPAA violation? Because I don't want to have to put the chart somewhere else. I want the doc to see the chart in the door when he or she walks in to see the patient. So that was sort of over worrying and overthinking, and there's certainly situations in which information may be shared in ways that sometimes we think, oh my God, I can't do that, it's going to violate HIPAA. You need to step back and think about, really, am I really looking to totally change my workflow because of some concern that I have? Is that an appropriate concern? So again, in a sense, that goes back into the design thinking circle. You really need to define the problem, and you need to make sure that you're not overthinking it in some way to your detriment.
Well, I think certainly too in this age of cybersecurity, incidents and issues and breaches, obviously there is this extreme focus on the electronic part of health records, but there is a paper fact as well. I mean, obviously HIPAA was around way before the HITECH Act and the HIPAA Omnibus of 2013, and all of that happened afterwards in the electronic world, and paper is still an issue.
Right. And now, of course, I mean, a lot of people have something to say on this question. Do we need to revamp HIPAA because it was written at a time when we were not quite so wired or wireless as we are today? A lot has been said and written about that question. Personally, I don't think that we need to run and revise the rules because technology will change again before the ink is dry on
Sure.
new legislation, given the pace at which things happen in Washington, and the pace at which things happen in the cloud. So we have standards, and those standards are applicable to a variety of factual situations, and it seems to work pretty well.
Right, right. So we've already touched upon SRA. So one of the attendees had asked, should we do a risk assessment for each application separately? And each is in all caps bold.
Well,
I
you
think
need
they
to,
must have a lot of applications.
yeah, right.
That's what I'm taking from that.
So that's maybe a design question at the outset. Is there a way that you can consolidate some of what you're doing? But putting that aside, the short answer is it's not a question of each, it's a question of all.
Yeah.
So you need to really look at your entire environment. How is PHI, protected health information, stored, transmitted, shared, secured, etc., within your operation? That's what you're looking at. That's the question that you have to answer. And you have to answer whether that is being done in a way that's compliant across the entire environment, across all applications.
Yeah. I mean, it's a flow, a flow chart or a spreadsheet or some sort of software tool that you can use to track all of that. So
Yeah, so OCR has a tool, sort of a self-audit, but really, that's sort of a trigger to thinking, and there's sort of a lot of thinking you have to do on your own. There are a variety of services that can come in and help you with, and consulting firms if you want to, go beyond that. But at the very basic level, there's the rules, and you need to sort of review your environment and your practices against the rules. And there are tools that sort of help walk you through that, whether it's through the government website or through something like HIPAA Cow, which
yeah,
is
I like HIPAA cow. Yeah.
right, put together by folks in Wisconsin, hence the cow in the acronym.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
worth checking out if you're looking for something like that and you haven't seen it.
Yeah. You don't hear that very often. Go check out HIPAA cow. We're an IT service provider and work with covered entities. We find overall that most independent practices are not concerned about HIPAA or erroneously think that they're not at risk. What we have found is an effective way to help practice managers to be more willing to talk about HIPAA and meeting the standards of the security rules specifically. But they often assume that their IT company is handling compliance, but they are not. What advice do you have?
Well, it sounds like you're already following the first part of any advice I can give you, which is to give people the cold hard facts.
Yeah.
And I think it's useful to share with covered entities in that circumstance some sort of props, if you will. There's a variety of types of controls that need to be in place, right, in order to satisfy the security rule. Administrative, technical, and oh shoot.
Oh.
I'm gonna turn into one of those politicians who can't remember the things on his own list. Uh, we'll come back to
We'll
that.
come back to that.
Administrative, technical, and the other one, concerns that you need to address in securing protected health information, and physical, administrative, physical, and technical. So uh, an IT services provider cannot provide physical security inside the four walls of the office. That should be readily apparent to someone managing a physician office.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's just the first line of discussion, is that there's a variety of parameters that need to be secured. I can take care of some of them, but you have to take care of others.
Right. And if you're audited by the OCR and your line of defense is, well, I thought my IT services made me compliant, it's it's not going to go very far.
Doesn't fly.
Yeah.
Yeah, the phrase that way precedes HIPAA and all of this is simply this: ignorance of the law is no excuse.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, hello from a long-time fan. I appreciate your sharing of info and your opinions, Frank. Thank you so much, Frank. We appreciate you giving us a, giving us a giving us a plug. Um, are companies required to retain paper copies of claims if they have been scanned? Can risk of breach through paper be reduced by shredding immediately or soon after scanning? Does the
Yeah,
scan lives on though, right? Electronically?
sure, but it can be secured
But it can't be
perhaps in
secured.
an
Yeah.
easier way. Yeah, no need to keep things in multiple formats in multiple places. That makes life messy and harder to manage. Um, Depending on local law, generally speaking, any electronic document, electronic signature, et cetera, is just as good as the paper version. So unless there's some unique situation under state law, there would be really no reason to hold on to any paper documents
Right, right.
at this stage in the game.
Yeah. Our attendees are helping you out, administrative, technical, and physical. That was that
Thank
was
you.
that was the third. Thank you so much, audience. Okay, um, you've talked in previous HIPAA chats, and actually even on we talked about it on our cybersecurity panel discussion a few months back about the Internet of Things, IoT. Would IoT include being sure no patient data is stored outside the U.S.?
So Internet of Things encompasses the whole variety of devices that we use, sort of smart devices of one sort or another. And those smart devices are connected to their back-end servers, right?
Sure.
And the question is sort of what are the HIPAA requirements? For example, if an IoT smart device is being used in a manner that brings it within the scope of HIPAA. Okay, so you can have a Fitbit on your wrist that's covered by HIPAA if it was prescribed to you by your physician or given to you by your health insurance company, and the data is going to them for management of your care in some way. Or it can be completely outside of HIPAA if you just went to the store and bought it. Or, well, I don't know if anybody goes to the store and buys things anymore, but
I know,
you
yeah,
get
I know.
what I mean.
I got mine online. Yeah, say that, but yeah,
So,
it's true. Yeah.
so two different situations where you could come to be using an IoT device that's web connected. Two different regulatory structures that govern the data. In the case of HIPAA covered data, the best argument is that data ought to be stored in the US. for Internet of Things that fall into the sort of personal data, sort of personal health record kind of data, but not electronic health record, PHI kind of data. There wouldn't be a requirement that they be stored in the US. There's not a hard and fast requirement in the first instance that they be stored in the US, but just think about your situation if you are the physician who prescribed or the health insurance company that provided a Fitbit in such a way where the data is going to be governed by HIPAA. The data repository operator is now your business associate, and you need to satisfy yourself as a covered entity that that business associate is in full compliance with HIPAA. Now, if it is physically located at an Amazon data center or some other data center, Microsoft Azure or whatever else, or Google Cloud facility within the US, then you will have some level of confidence that if you've signed all the appropriate agreements, that is going to be held in a way that is compliant with HIPAA. If, however, it is stored abroad, depending on the country that it's in and the state of its court system, you may not have the same level of confidence
Right.
that rules about access and proper handling of data are going to be followed and are going to be enforceable in the same way. So that's really where it breaks down.
And what about medical devices?
In terms of storage of data or other sorts of questions here?
Yeah, so just somebody sort of chatting in, and I know that we've talked about, and there's lots out there recently about how the security issues around medical devices. So, and
Right.
yeah, you've touched upon that too. So it's
Mhm.
just a general question out there.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a security concern where something is accessible wirelessly or otherwise. And famously, former Vice President Dick Cheney had sort of in his
Oh, yeah,
IoT connected pacemaker, he had
yeah.
the wireless functions were turned off because of a concern that that could have been used in some sort of attack, and that was actually a plot line in a cable TV show that some of us may have binge watched.
Not me.
Yeah, things are bad when I'm binge watching shows that have to do with the security of medical devices.
That's so funny. I mean, but it's like really, I mean, that was a real incident. I mean, that was, really kind
Right, so
of,
that was a real concern.
yeah, real
Uh, so,
concern.
yeah, so that is a real concern, and that sort of concern is growing, obviously, as more and more data goes online, as more and more devices become connected, and the question is, what are we doing to solve these problems? And here's where we come full circle on the question of security by design. I don't want to have to stay up at night wondering whether or not my implanted cardio
Right,
whatever is
right,
secure.
right,
I just
right,
want to know that it is. So
right,
how do we build in security by design? And that is an area of this field that is very fertile right now, and a lot of people are building things and trying to do things. How do we create a solution that's just, pardon my French, idiot proof?
right,
How do we just put something out there? We sell the solution, we've done the design thinking, and we hand it to a customer on a silver platter and say, just turn it on, it works. You don't need to think about it. That's what I want, that's what you all want, right? And if it works, then we're golden. We're not really there yet, but there's some interesting projects in the works. There's some things that work in very specific situations or circumstances or for certain applications. But that's really what I'd like to see. That's, I think, what we'd all like to see.
Right, right. Interestingly enough, back to the IoT overseas question, one of the attendees chatted in FYI, Arizona law, and it's important, it kind of brings up this thought that actually laws do different state by state. Arizona law says cannot allow access to PHI overseas. A consulting firm was planning to use offshore support that required access to ePHI, and they had to modify the approach due to this law.
Right. So that, I mean, that sort of highlights a general warning that I give to people in, all the time. This is not just about HIPAA compliance. This is about legal and regulatory compliance with all things that apply to your use and storage and transmission of health data. It's federal. It's not just HIPAA, it's broader federal rules. It's state law. Depends on the state that you're in, the state that you're operating in. For an individual local practice, you need to look at your own local practice, your own state's laws. If you're selling a solution, before you start selling it in all 50 states, you need to investigate the laws of all 50 states and see how they apply to your solution, your situation. That's the kind of work that I do with some of my clients in order to determine how do we need to tweak the features of a product before starting to offer it in all 50 states.
Okay. And then of course there are some very large hospital systems that have hospitals in different states, and health organizations and whatnot. Okay, is layered security in quotes still the best strategy against the evolving number of security threats to health IT? Understanding that it seems like there are going to be more threats, not less types of threats as we go forward, right? I mean, everything's just going to get more sophisticated.
Oh, I mean, sure. More.
I don't know what they mean. I don't know.
More,
I'm not sure what the asker is saying about layered security.
yeah, well, I mean, Mies van der Rohe, famous architect of the 20th century, said less is more. But in this situation, more is more. You need more layers. You need several rings of defenses. You need the moat and the drawbridge and the walls and the guys on top pouring, hot oil on the invaders. You need to take all of these steps in order to make sure that you really don't get breached, because the consequences of breach are extremely traumatic. So why not have, belt and suspenders, right?
Right.
Everything about patching your OS. That's the very basic foundation, right? So what about, depending, I've been in many different situations, seeing providers deal with this in different ways, but think about this yourselves. How many people in your office have the credentials to install new software on any given machine in the office? If the answer is more than one, I think you need to think about that. Or is there a way where you've established only a whitelisted set of programs that they can install? So 5 people can install, but they can only select from a group of 20 programs. Other than that, they can't do anything. And talking about those sorts of authorizations, you also just need to think about who has the right to see what kind of data. Not everybody needs to see everything. And if you minimize the number of touch points, then you minimize the risk. So if somebody clicks, unfortunately, on a link in a phishing email, which happens all the time, sadly, the damage is limited.
Right.
It can go on. There's other kinds of things to think about in terms of layering protections,
Yeah.
but
Well, and
very important.
what is your protocol for changing passwords when somebody, I mean, not just gets fired, but quits too? You know what I mean? And maybe it's not just always about, somebody's let go under a difficult circumstance, but when people quit as well, well, what did they have access to, and how do what is your game plan for that kind of very common event, basically, not just the
Right.
uncommon ones? Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, it's not just the situation when someone shows up in the person's workspace and escorts them off the premises.
Right,
Yeah,
right,
it's
right,
in all circumstances.
right. So what sort of just sort of a general question. This person wrote cost effective, but that's a tough thing to talk about. But what sort of training do you recommend for clinical staff? Again, that's pretty general, but certainly I'm sure there are best practices to.
Hmm. Well, I mean, the first thing to note is that I often see people use the same canned training and testing program year after year for the entire workforce,
Ad nauseum, yeah,
right?
right, right.
So, number one, your employees have seen the same thing last year, and even if they mix up the presentation and the Q&A a little bit, it's basically the same thing year after year. They're bored, they're falling asleep, they're not really being trained in any meaningful way. They'll get the minimum test score that they need to not lose their job or whatever, but that's not set at a very high bar usually. Um, the real thing that you need to do is to have training that is tailored to a particular employee's actual work. So somebody doing tasks A, B, and C doesn't need to be trained on the perils of working with tasks D, E, and F. Right? And I see that all the time where people are being trained on stuff that's completely irrelevant to their work life, and as a result, they fall asleep, and then they don't. They're asleep when they need to hear something that is relevant to them.
They literally are asleep at the wheel.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The other thing, one of my favorite things to talk about, and I've probably mentioned this in a previous HIPAA chat, is do poking and prodding in creative ways. Send out a fake phishing email and see if
Right.
people get fooled or not. And if they do get fooled, they're going to click on something that's safe. It's not, in fact, a phishing email, but it'll bring them to a web page that has a little bit of education based on what it is that they clicked.
Right,
So again,
right.
very focused education is much better than broad education.
That's a great idea. Um, eh, back to SRA. Should we be doing an SRA, security risk analysis, every year, calendar, or incidental, or both?
So couple of different things. Some people may be familiar with the term SRA from the context of meaningful use um, incentives. And what
Yes.
we're talking about now is different than that. So there are two different kinds of, or two different circumstances in which a risk assessment is required. What we're talking about today is a risk assessment for purposes of HIPAA compliance. And that sort of risk assessment should be done at a minimum on an annual basis, but more frequently if any of the operations have changed, right? So if you put in a whole new EHR system, if you put in a new billing system, if you um, make other changes in your operations, you should be doing a new risk assessment in the context of that change.
That incident, right?
I mean, so it's not an
Uh,
incident. That's not a security incident by any means,
oh, right. No,
but
right. It's a change
you've
though, and flow, and right,
you've stopped using product A and you're using product B.
right.
Okay, time for a little look-see and make sure that you're putting everything in place that you need to have in place.
Gets back to that each application question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
That's
right.
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 Yeah, so if you change any one of those applications, you need to relook at your entire setup.
So we're gonna leave HIPAA chat with a interesting question from one of our regular followers and somebody who actually writes for us. Um, and he chats in, is it time to pull the plug? Meaning, should we limit what is online and connected and start reducing information rather than keep adding more? And obviously, we in healthcare we have been adding more since, before the HITECH Act, obviously, but certainly the Meaning of Use program has incentivized this push, as just living in a digital age. And so the idea being, should we be putting less healthcare information online versus the current trend of adding more?
Well, I think that it's very important to continue to use these tools to add data to our collective knowledge, because ultimately the value of the incentive program that put more and more data into electronic form is not for local use, is not for, oh, I come into the same office or the same hospital or the same clinic for procedure X and my follow-up and my annual visit and whatever. That's not where the real value is. You could be served almost as well by a set of paper records in that circumstance. The real value for the individual is, well, gee, I'm in Arizona and I'm unconscious and I'm taken to an emergency room and somebody needs to pull my records from Massachusetts.
Yeah,
How do we
right,
do that?
right.
Um, we're now on the cusp of being able to do that more effectively, uh, given the conversations we're having about interoperability.
Yeah,
Even more important than that, to my mind, is the promise of electronic health records for population health.
right,
To the extent that we can abstract from individual records learnings that will be applicable to and used in improving all of our health collectively, that's really where the value is in all of this. And
right.
if we lock everything down, we don't get to unlock that value.
Right. That is the big question. Of course, we just hosted, and for those of you who haven't quite left us, if you go on YouTube and our channel, High Tech Cancers channel, we just did a interoperability panel discussion that talked quite a bit about this. This dream of interoperability for the reasons that you talk about. Population health and outcomes to benefit everybody. So if you're interested, go ahead and search that out. And it was a fascinating conversation we had last week. Uh, David, I don't know where the hour goes. It just flies by. But we will be back again.
It's because HIPAA is so much fun. You
We'll
have
be,
to live it to
you
really
have to live
understand it.
it. We will be back again for another HIPAA chat in a few weeks, and look forward to having you back and another fun-filled topic. Thank you again, and thank you of course, to our audience and our attendees. You make HIPAA chat happen for us. And until our next HIPAA chat, everybody take care.